So let me start by saying thank you for the invitation. Jerry is also very persuasive. So we've had some opportunities, our office and the Anish-Korchak Association, to do a number of things together. So I'm very appreciative of that. And as a way of beginning too, I just want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, particularly the Musqueam in this location where we are. And it's always important for me to remember on whose land I am walking. In British Columbia, there are 203 First Nations, and you'll hear as I talk about British Columbia that really changes the way in which we have to show up as representatives and as advocates for children and youth. But by reminding myself and each other about the land on whose land we're walking on, it's a reminder that on this land there have been many, 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 many generations of Indigenous peoples doing their work, raising and loving their children, and bringing culture and tradition into the ways in which children are embraced. So good to remember that we have some important things to look back on in history, both from the point of view of all the good and also the evil that can be wrought upon children. So there we go. I want to just start with framing a little bit about who I am. This was my undergrad graduation photograph from 1981 when I graduated in the School of Child and Youth Care. So a couple of things. One is, anything you notice about that group? Pardon me? Women and white, yes. So there are so many things that in the course of my 42-year journey in the field of child and youth care that I have actually had to unlearn. There are also a few things that I've had to relearn. So when I started in the School of Child and Youth Care at University of Victoria back in the 70s, I was introduced to two really important concepts. One, and there were two, there was a book called The Other 23 Hours that I read, and there was also an introduction to Janusz Korczak's teachings that was given by Dr. Jim Anglin at the time. We actually didn't have a text, so I'm thinking that much of what's been created has been translated since then. But Jim, for some reason, knew the story and translated that. So there are two things. The Other 23 Hours, back then, when children were struggling, they were put into institutional environments. They were emotionally disturbed, and they were taken from their families and communities and put into institutional environments. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But the idea of the other 23 hours was the belief or the sense that there was 1 hour a day in which clinical treatment would be done, largely by a psychologist or psychiatrist. But in these institutional environments, the other 23 hours were what people like me did. That's where we built relationships, where we created normative developmental experiences, where we were trying to love and nurture a child. So that was a very powerful way to begin to think about the work that I was doing, was that it was fundamentally about relationship, respect, and love. And then you bring that in with Korczak's teachings about respect and rights and honoring and child's voice. And it was pretty mind-blowing given where we were at as an institution, as a system of care. Because when you think about that time, it doesn't look like anybody's from that time, but we were still, it was behavioral. It was about a token economy. It was like, okay, you do this as I say it, then you get this little reward. So we were treating them like pigeons and rats. So to have, and that was the context within which we were working, so to be able to have my tuition, my teaching, talk about a fundamentally different way of interacting with children to bring about their well-being was, as I say, very mind-blowing and very progressive at the time. So that's my origin story. So I was raised up in a good way by many amazing teachers, and so there was a lot of really good foundation, but there were also, as you can see from our whiteness and our gender disparity, we also have a number of things to unlearn or to relearn and to figure out how to do differently. So there we go. So one of the other things that became really clear very early on was this notion of the difference between quality and equity, because it was a lot about, as you think about that kind of time, it was very much about, we'll make things equal, or, it has to look a certain way, and there was a tremendous desire for uniformity. And so the shift in thinking was to think more about equity, and then also to recognize where we were standing and what we were needing to address in terms of the reality of child's experience. And if you think about this, Korczak talks a lot about the experience of Jewish children, the experience of children living in poverty. I think the parallel in our situation in British Columbia is the Indigenous child. And then increasingly, given the growth in the number of refugee and immigrant children who have had tremendous trauma in their lives before they've come here. And in certain areas of British Columbia, it's very much about the racialized child as well. So those are a couple of things. So I've had, one of the things that happened, again, I'll kind of go back to the story. One of the things that happened for me in my work was that I realized pretty early on that those kind of institutional environments actually weren't working very well. We removed a child from their family. We created a very, institutional, rule-bound environment in which there was a tremendous disparity of power and the children had very little power. And then we plopped them back into the context within which they'd come from, and it would be like, oh, they're not fixed, or the parents did it wrong because they didn't sustain the behavioral techniques that were being implemented. So that was a pretty significant thing to begin to think, well, that's not working, so now what? So then that began a process for me of saying, well, just a second, children are in families, so maybe we need to think about the family. And then I thought, over time, I began to learn from many good teachers, but families are in communities. So if we aren't attending to the well-being of community, we actually can't support the well-being of child. So really beginning to understand what's the kind of systemic environment within which we create the conditions for children to be successful. And I've learned that a lot from young people themselves. We were together at this one. Learned that a lot from young people, from the people who love young people and care and are on the front lines, etc. So fast forward, I've had quite a varied career. Happy to talk with you offline about that. It made no sense in some ways until I had the opportunity to become the representative for children and youth, and now I look back and go, retrospective coherence. All those things I did, whether I was working in the early years, I was working in, the only area that I haven't worked in actually is youth justice. But every other area, mental health, addictions, early years, resource development, child protection, etc., I've worked in over time. So I had the opportunity to become the representative for children and youth 9 months ago, and I want to acknowledge my two amazing colleagues, Michelle and Bronwyn. These are actually experts in two areas that I'm going to talk about, so I may have to shut up and invite other comments in. But our office is a group of about 70 people. And I have the tremendous privilege of leading this group and being representative, which is an independent officer of the Legislative Assembly in the province of British Columbia, which means I'm similar to the Ombudsperson, the Auditor General, Privacy Commissioner, and this in British Columbia, Police Complaints Commissioner, Ethics Commissioner, etc. So that's an independent office of the legislature. So how did we start? I think it's important to understand that we started out of trauma, out of a horrific case that led to a review done by the Honorable Ted Hughes, which the Korczak Association honored several weeks ago. Honorable Hughes and his wife Helen Hughes were honored. But he recommended that an independent office be created in order to, and I love this, assist, encourage, and sometimes prod the government to be more aware and responsive to the individual concerns of children, families, and youth. And to go from that, and I love this notion of assisting and encouraging, remember that, because there are many different ways in which we can have influence, any one of us. And said he recognized that. He recognized that there are different ways that we might have, bring about changes. And then he also said, and to recommend changes, to bring about the kinds of things that will address the systemic issues that we're seeing or the recurring issues that we're seeing for children and youth. What's important is the way in which the office has evolved since 2006 is that we are, and I feel very strongly about this, as being a rights-based organization. So we're very much guided by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And that, and you know these rights, they're often aspirational, they're often hard to pin down, but it's so important that we have frameworks like that that can hold us accountable and that we can refer back to in order to understand how we might do our work. So I want to share a little bit about what we do and try and connect it to this whole notion of what are the different mechanisms we have in which we can elevate and honor and respect children's rights. And you've heard I love the story that you've told in the Walking the Talk. So it's really important for us to think about, well, so how do we walk the talk as an organization that could stay kind of high in the levels? So our purpose is to be an independent advocate and an oversight body. So we work, as you'll see in a few moments, we work at the individual level and the systemic level, and we hold those two, sometimes in tension, sometimes in collaboration. And we have to fundamentally champion the rights of and well-being of the children and youth that are in the province of British Columbia. And particularly for those youth who are most vulnerable, those youth who are incarcerated in justice and youth justice, voluntarily detained in mental health institutions, in the child protection system, and in high conflict environments. So that's what we are. And for me, this is a photograph that I just love. So this is of a friend, this is Bradley Dick, who's an amazing Indigenous leader from the Kwungan speaking territories, Songhees. This is his granddaughter. She is 4, which is amazing. She's an incredible singer and drummer. And she is singing and drumming at an elders gathering. And I put that up because it's so important to remember what we're trying to bring to life. And when you take a look at Bradley looking at, he calls her little granny because she's a wise soul. And when he's looking at little granny, he's just got that beautiful love in his eyes and his spirit. And she knows that. So here she is, she's at an elders gathering and she's sharing her song and her drumming. And honestly, there's not a dry eye in the house. Even recalling it, I get emotional.
And she sits low.
And he sits low and he's letting her do it. He's not saying, okay, you accompany me. He is going, you can do it, little granny. It's just beautiful. And I use that because it's just such a good reminder to me of what we're trying to create. Like, it's one thing to say we're a rights-based organization and we advocate and whatnot, but it's also important for us, I think, to have in mind what we're trying to bring to life for the well-being of our children. And as an Indigenous child, there are a lot of things that happen to many of the Indigenous children in this province. So if we remember that there's so much more that we can bring to life and aspire to. So that's Bradley. So from my perspective, it's important that as a representative, so obviously I am not working alone. Not only do we have 70 staff, but there are thousands of people that want us to be successful, organizations like HELP, probably others here. But fundamentally we have the privilege really of representing the best interests of children going forward in their lives, and we want them to have good life outcomes. It's also really important to me, and I wanted to emphasize this, that we have to also create workplaces. So how many of you are in situations where you're supervising or you're kind of guiding organizations? Anybody? Okay. How many of you are working in on teams or in workplaces? A few of you. Okay. It makes a difference the kind of environment that we create within which we can do our work. We can't be great rights-based advocates unless we're also in environments where we feel like our voices are being honored, etc. So that's another thing that's important for me to bring to life is what's the kind of environment that allows us to do our best work on children and youth. And the other thing that's important for me is to remain curious. There's actually so many things that are that's so complex. I don't know, even after 42 years and tons of wonderful people that provide advice and counsel, I don't know the answers on a lot of these complex issues that we're dealing with. So we have to continually ask ourselves, what do we want to create for children and youth? How do we create more Bradley and little grandmas, grannies situations? What are the kinds of things that we want our children to be prepared for in the world? How do we honor and respect and prepare them? And the poem that you spoke to is a beautiful encapsulation of that. And so how do we, I should change this to the 3 Ps, how do we support participation? How do we protect? How do we uphold their voices going forward? So that's a little bit. Now, just to describe us so that you have a sense of this, and then I'll pull out a couple of stories as well. So we have a legal mandate. We're created by statute, the Representative for Children and Youth Act. And I should say that, are all of you from BC? Anybody from elsewhere? All BC? Okay. So nobody from Ontario. Good. So across the country, we were moving quite well towards having an advocate's office in almost every province and territory. The only outliers was PEI and Northwest Territories. They don't have a child advocate or an office that is responsible for child advocacy. PEI came on board and they now have a child advocate, and then the Doug Ford government eliminated the Ontario office, which was from my view catastrophic because they were serving a significant number of children, thousands and thousands of children, and they were actually the poster child in this country on youth engagement and youth participation. So it's tragic. That was another thing that was honored by the Crotchek Association was Irwin Elman, who was the first and so far the only advocate in the province of Ontario. So, like others across the country, we're created by statute, and so we have 3 primary aims that we have to fulfill. Advocacy, so that, and I'll talk some more about each of these, but I'll just give you the overview first. Advocacy, we have the opportunity to advocate with and for young people, children and youth, and that's Bronwyn's area of expertise as a manager of advocacy within our organization. So individual advocacy, a child or a young person can contact us, or somebody who cares about that child and knows the situation can reach out to us, and we can provide support if they are or should be receiving services primarily from Ministry of Children and Family Development in this province, but also some other areas of service, and assist them in navigating the tricky terrain of service delivery in this province. The other part about advocacy that we're trying to develop and build up is, as you can appreciate, when you have thousands of advocacy calls and you hear thousands of stories, that's a rich pool of data. So what we're trying to do is figure out the different ways that we can harvest out those patterns and themes that say, this is a recurring issue. Children are experiencing this, and that's not supportive of where they need to go and what's important for them. This area of the province is problematic. It keeps having the same kinds of issues. So we're trying to harvest those patterns and themes so that we can choose ways, we can discern ways to be influential and as Ted says, assist and encourage the government to move forward, as well as prod. So advocacy is an important body. That's, if you will, that's our forward face. That's the way in which we're connected out into community primarily, and I have information for you to take away. The other group is critical injuries and deaths, and Michelle, a colleague, is part of that team. And imagine this, that a child in this province who's receiving some services, something very significant happens to them. They've been sexually assaulted, they've self-harmed, they've been beaten, something along those lines. So and that happens a lot. So every month we receive critical injury reports. So these reports come to us primarily from Ministry of Children and Family Development staff. And then Michelle's team takes a look at those. They've been rising. There's probably 240 to 250 seems to be the monthly average of those reports coming in. And the team reviews those, looks into the history or the background, the initial background of this, and then brings forward a number of them that are within our legislative mandate, typically 100, 120, that we review as a full executive team to see what needs to be done here. Because again, those critical injuries can teach us something. They can say, we're seeing an increase in the number of children with this kind of experience in their life, or we're seeing this particular thing that's happening over and over again in this kind of a resource. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We're seeing an increasing number of children who are trans, gender non-binary, gender fluid. That it's not a huge number, but it's an increasing number. It's a significant number. But what's interesting is if you compare them against the other children that we might learn about with critical injuries or deaths, the primary critical injury that they're experiencing is self-harming and suicide attempts or suicide completions. So that says something to us. It's like, okay, now you go into then you've got a little bit of a clue, right? Then you say, well, what might be going on? What else could we learn? And what we can learn if we go into the literature, we begin to ask the people that really know a lot about this, is that actually would be expected because of the way in which society often responds to these children and how we deny them their sense of identity or the emergence of their identity going forward. So when we think about the connection back to rights and about listening and respecting children, the fact that we aren't respecting child's right to form an identity, and denying them that right in many cases, or doing other harmful things, that escalates the risk factors that they experience. So that's important for us to pay attention to. Another group of young people that we're seeing all too often is Indigenous girls between the ages of 15 and 18. And how many of you do any of you work with Indigenous populations? Whereabouts do you work?
I work for the Richer Initiative Social Pediatrics Program in the downtown side.
Oh, awesome. Okay. So you probably have a lot to add to this discussion as well. Anybody else that works with Indigenous young people? Okay. So see if this fits with your experience. So what we're seeing is young women who have had, typically there's intergenerational and historical trauma. So lots of things have happened within their families, a lot of things that have gone on, generations past and also within their immediate environment. We're seeing that there are significant mental health or substance use issues that either they are experiencing, the people that are immediately around them are experiencing, sexual exploitation, sexual violence, multiple placements. They've been brought into care and they've bounced around a lot, and they haven't had that kind of stability that I think every child needs to have. It kind of gets to the protective piece. And what ends up happening is really bad things happen to those children. And Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls reports really speaks to a lot of that as well. But here's the thing. When we look back on the stories of those young people, there's two things that we were noticing. One is that for many of them, we knew when they were much younger that things weren't going well, and we didn't act in a fulsome way in order to create the environment in which they could be successful, and their families could be successful, and their communities could be successful. We're also seeing that for many of them, the narrative in our service delivery system has been that, well, they're resistant, they're non-compliant. And my reaction to that is, frankly, bullshit. Come on, if they're saying, I don't want what you have on offer, we obviously aren't offering what they need. And we're not asking them. So when we get back to that notion of the child's voice and the child's rights, this is such a critical thing. When we see stuff happening, then we need to figure out how might we learn more from the lived expertise that that young person has about their situation and what they need. So those are a couple of examples of what we see when we begin to take a look at the critical injuries. The other thing that happens for us is we're looking for those themes and patterns, but we're also saying, what can we do right now? Does this young person need an advocate? We can assign an advocate. Does this person, do we need to get involved in some way and raise it as a case of concern with government and say, you know, we're really worried about this young person. Can you please follow up and report back to us? Is this something that we want to perhaps, through the advocacy, start to convene a bigger conversation? So there's a number of things available to us when we start to look at what's going on with our critical injuries and deaths. And the third area that we're responsible for is monitoring and research. So there's a couple of ways we can monitor things like, you know, we're seeing what's happening in advocacy in the CID area. It's like, okay, well, maybe we should do some more research in that. So an area that we're doing research in right now is fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. And in FASD, we see many of the young people that are really struggling have often a very late diagnosis in FASD or suspected, but because there's so much shame and stigma associated with it, in the young, yeah.
What's the acronym stand for?
Sorry, fetal alcohol syndrome
Yeah.
disorder.
Spectrum
Yeah.
disorder. Thank you. Spectrum.
And
Spectrum
Alicia,
disorder.
you had a question. Yeah, I saw the hand. Yeah?
Yeah.
I was just going to ask about the 120 children.
Yeah.
Is that children that are in the child welfare system, or is that children in the general population?
Great, thank you for clarifying. It's children who are receiving services that we have under our act, reviewable services. And so these children would be, many are in care, many are receiving services, and they might be in care by agreement, or they might be in care through the courts, through temporary custody or continuing custody, or they might be receiving services from one aspect of government. So it's interesting because that means there are lots and lots of kids that we don't hear about that would also be very interesting. And in fact, our mandate, the health authorities are supposed to submit these reports as well. So we would be getting things from emergency or adolescent psychiatric units, et cetera. And we haven't been successful in convincing the health authorities to comply as yet. We're working on that. So yeah, you're right. It's actually quite a narrow population.
It's pretty high.
Yeah,
They should be.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
it does include mental health services. So a child might live at home,
yes,
but be receiving a mental health service,
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
and then if they were self-harmed.
yeah, yeah. So if they're receiving a service, then. So yes, it does seem alarming, but it's an interesting thing. So the numbers have been going up, and just as an aside, I think, well, the fact that the numbers are going up isn't an indication that there are more injuries happening. It's an indication that people are getting better at reporting. And frankly, I think it's so important that we gather this information, that we understand what's happening to the most vulnerable kids, because the more that we understand about high vulnerability, the more that we can actually begin to reverse engineer the systems of care and the systems of support, including the education system, to support all children. So yesterday I was meeting with the Minister of Education, and the Ministry of Education has been fantastic. It's the poster child of a ministry to work with, to be honest, because they have responded so well to recommendations that we have put forward, and they are actively engaged in addressing the experience of children and youth who are in care within the education system and Indigenous children. So we're seeing, and you'll see a little bit later, we're seeing some dramatic improvements in some of the school districts because they're just all in to try and figure out how to support the kids who are most vulnerable. Because they get, if they create, it's like the safe and sound. If you create a safe environment for the kids who are most vulnerable, it's a sound world for all. So same thing, if you create safe environments for kids in schools, then you can create a sound environment for all children and all those that are interacting with the education system. Any other questions? Okay. So our third area, again, monitoring. So taking a look at things like fetal alcohol spectrum, and we've been doing that in a way because we see that as a consideration. And when we started to take a look at the data, it's like there's $5.2 million in this province spent on FASD. It's 81.8 million spent in autism. Now, how many of you work with young people in autism spectrum? Okay. So we know that it's not sufficient the way that it is right now. So not pitting one against the other, one diagnosis against the other, or one area of concern. But if we know that autism is not getting, that young people with autism are not getting the support they need, how in heck is 5 million going to go far enough in a province this fast? And when you start to think about who are most affected, it's primarily Indigenous children, not solely by any stretch of the imagination, but it's really important to think, well, what's our accountability here? We really need to understand this. And again, how do we address it from the point of view of the shame and the stigma, but most important, privilege the child's voice in this. So we are spending time walking alongside young people in their day-to-day life to understand what's it like to be in your skin, and what are some of the things that give you joy, that create positivity, that help you learn, what are some of the things that are taking away from that, and how can we amplify those things that are going to be important. So monitoring does those kinds of things. They're taking also a look at children aging into adulthood, and they also, because we issue recommendations, they monitor the implementation of recommendations so we know something's happening. Want to note a couple of things. One is that this is nested in a bubble of Indigenous strategies. 60% of the young people in care receiving services are Indigenous children, and there's lots of reasons that that's happened to young people. There's, as we like to say now, it's not that there's an over-representation of Indigenous people in the child welfare system, it's that the child welfare system is over-involved in the lives of Indigenous people. So we have to really reimagine how that looks, so we're trying to do that ourselves. And then the other thing that's so important, which really speaks to the work that Jonathan was talking about, is engagement of youth and community. So children and youth's voices and their community's voices, people who know them. What are they saying? What do we need to pay attention to? So that's who we are. But here's something about, our ways of being, our ways of walking in our work. And hopefully this is useful to you as you think about translating it into your different contexts. So youth and community engagement is a way of being. It's a way of walking in the world. So, and it's got its roots in social movements. Jonathan talked about Gandhi. That's a social movement. People who've been involved in the disability sector, that was a movement to deinstitutionalize, a movement to bring, to create a community around folks. So the fundamental issue here is nothing about us without us. So that's a way of walking. It's easier said than done, right? Because our systems are so oriented towards having the answer and linearity, etc. And so to bring in a youth perspective or a child's perspective sometimes upsets the apple cart. So easier said than done, but it's an important way of being. Come on. Maybe not. There we go. Okay. So this is actually a beautiful piece of work that can be downloaded off of the internet. The Children's Aid Foundation of Canada did a piece on youth engagement that I often read things about youth engagement that are actually not written by youth. So this was actually done through youth coming together and saying, this is what matters, this is what makes a difference to us. So that's the notion of youth engagement, and something that we have to be mindful of is how is it that we participate and keep learning and keep measuring how successful we are in going forward. And they talk about it being meaningful, ethical, and sustainable. So meaningful and sustainable is not about having a gathering, getting youth input and saying, thank you very much, I'm going to leave now, right? It's not sustainable and it's not meaningful. Ethical is not about asking a young person with lived expertise to tell their story in front of a bunch of adults. And the more emotional story, the better, which I often see as well. That is not youth engagement because it's not ethical to put a situation in which, put a young person in a situation in which they could be re-traumatized by that experience, unless that's something that they have said very clearly and with a lot of support and understanding of what the impact might be, that they are saying, no, I want to do this is important, and it's my choice. So those are important things to think about as we go forward. It's just a gathering. This was a gathering of youth advisors from around the province, and this is one incredible young spokesperson, Bryant. And it was very interesting because, like you were talking about, there were a few adults that spoke, but by and large, just a few. I think I was given 15 minutes in a full day, and the minister was given 15 minutes in a full day, and that was basically it, to try and set this, to say, hey, here's who we are, and we really wish to understand, but the rest of the time was entirely designed and delivered by the young people themselves, including their poetry, their music, their storytelling, their dancing, etc., and all those, the richness and the beauty of these young people.